Well, Mike, thank you so much for joining us on A Photographic Life.
You're very welcome.
You're a bit of a hero to me, but you didn't realize that. I know. I followed your career since my days of studying design in the 1980s. Um,
Oh, wow.
well, your career goes before then as well, doesn't it?
Oh,
Back
yeah.
to the
Yeah.
1960s. Do you want to just talk a little bit about kind of where you began there with, particularly with book publishing and book publishing design?
Yeah, sure. Well, I didn't go to university at all. I left school at 15. I had one O level in art. I was dyslexic and am. So the world didn't look very rosy for me. And I had a series of unbelievably awful jobs because I came from Dagenham, which is a kind of working class motor town. Everyone was destined to work at Ford's. Even the school I went to, you could tell the teachers really didn't care very much because they thought, well, they're all going to go to Ford's anyway. But anyway, story short, I was determined not to do that, even though I had to do these terrible jobs. Something inside me was saying, look, you've got to do something with your ability. You can draw, you're creative. How do you get out of this mess? And I went to evening classes where I took on the only artistic course that was still on because I was so late in going to them. I went in November, and everyone was obviously there in September. And I got lettering and illuminated lettering. And I can't quite remember the whole thing. Anyway, it was you learned hand lettering and traditional calligraphy, which I actually realized actually I love this. And I found the reference library that they had there, which had a lot of books that, were meaningless to me until I discovered one that really intrigued me, and it was Joseph Muller-Brockman's book called "The Graphic Artist and His Design Problems," and I would look at that every week and slowly, and because even then my reading was not great, it took me a long time for it to sink in. But I thought there's a job where you work with images and space and type, and it's a job called graphic design. And so that was my from then on. I worked in little studios doing as a dog's body, and then I got locked into, I joined, I was with the library for many years, and I used to go and look rather than read. I'm a visual person, so I would go in like a vacuum cleaner looking around until I started to zero in on covers that I liked and thought, well, that's a world. And then I would go to, when I was working in these little studios, which is near Fleet Street, there was a bookshop at the end of Fleet Street that I would always go to and look at their books. And then I would look at the covers and decide, well, I don't think that's particularly very good. By this time, I'd consumed many American annuals because D&AD hadn't just started then. I mean, I bought the very first D&AD annual, and I've still got it along with all the others. So I would buy the American illustrators and the American graphic ones as well. And so I was consuming really American graphics, which I've discovered much later that they were a combination of, if you like, being inspired by Swiss design, but with the wit of the Americans. And so they made it fun. The Swiss design is great, but it's very serious. They take it very serious. There's no laughs at all. The Americans think, wow, this is great. This minimalism, I love it, but we've got to have a little bit of fun. And they do. And so I really enjoyed the American graphics scene. And so I ended up, via a strange coincidence, I went from these little studios and I'd started to get a little bit of freelance work from publishers. Really, all the publishers in London in the 60s were almost independent, more or less independent. And none of the big conglomerates had come over to gobble them all up. So I was doing I was illustrating, and I was photographing as well, because then you got such a small fee. if you wanted to illustrate, you had to do it yourself. If you wanted to have a photograph, you had to do it yourself. So I remember buying I bought a second-hand 35 millimeter East German Carl Zeiss camera. It was a, late 50s one, but it was great. I loved it. And I got various books on how to, and slowly fell in love with photography then. And so later, this evolved into my actually getting into publishing in a much more serious way because I started to do a lot of freelance work and various, there were no art directors. There was one or two, but generally it was usually an editor. And I've always described them as an editor with a corduroy jacket with patch elbows, that would be a bit trendy, rather than, and they would give you a brief, you go away, you have the manuscript, whatever, and you go back and show them, and they'd say, "Yeah, great," and that was it. It was that simple, and you got paid. And so I then started to work with bigger publishers. So William Heinemann and Hutchinson are two that I got a lot of work from. And I walked into with a cover for Heinemann, and the art director there had been to the Royal College of Art. He was an art director, and we got on very well. And he told me on this particular day that he was leaving. And I said, I was really rather pissed off because I thought, I was getting great work and he'd been at the Royal College and he was using a lot of Royal College people, really good people. And he said, "Why didn't you apply for the job?" And so I did via the bookseller, which is the organ of the publishing industry, that I had to find. I had to go to WH Smith, and they said, "No, we don't sell it. It's a subscription. You have to go to public library." Went to the library, found it, applied for the job. Um, was interviewed by three people that I realized very quickly that they didn't really know very much about the job because it was just one guy was the art director. And so I just basically lied about everything. They said, do you know, of course, you're familiar with printing. Well, I said, "Oh, yes, absolutely, no problem." I knew nothing at all. But anyway, as luck would have it, all of the printers that I had to, interact with were really great. They said, "Don't worry, we'll explain everything to you." And that became 5 years at that publishing house. And then I moved on to Collins and took over as art director of Fontana. So it was a 10-year period in publishing that I absolutely loved. And it came to an end because everything changed. William Collins died. His family all were part of the company. They were approached by a large American, conglomerate to buy their shares slowly. So they worked their way through the family, and then, hey presto, it was gobbled up. And that was the beginning of many at that time. And you realize that the American system was so aggressive in terms of, sales, and they had sales directors with assistants. At Heinemann, we had one guy who I'd go in and chat to, and I'd have to show covers to the managing director and the chairman. That's it. And you could argue your case. They'd say, "Well, couldn't the type be bigger?" And you'd say, "Well, whatever." And so I had a great time. And so my gripe with it now is I've watched it. I've watched it obsessively over so many years. It is a kind of illness almost, I think. I can't not go into a secondhand bookshop. I can't not go into a bookshop without zooming in there and looking, hoping. And I do, thank goodness there are still good designers around that manage somehow, mostly backlist, where the pressure on the salespeople it's not a big deal because they just regurgitate them with a new cover over and over, and it's just a money spinner. It's the new covers, and it's all of the new covers in all the areas that used to be so brilliant. For example, Penguin used to do all of their non-fiction was incredible. They used brilliant photographers, um, really minimal graphics. And even now, when I look at them, I think, God, these are so good. And you go into a Waterstones now and look at non-fiction, and it's appalling. It's
Right.
appalling.
Mike, I asked
Yes.
one question. There was no stopping you. Your passion came
So,
through.
sorry. Well, anyway, I
No,
was trying to cram that in for you
I
because,
know you are.
anyways,
I
so
know, and
that's where we got to.
it's absolutely brilliant. And there are so many things in there that you've just said, which I think are so relevant to now as to
Mhm.
where we are. There are a few. You and I have a shared background in design and editorial design, designing with
Yes,
image and text,
yes.
which I've always felt is something that's quite often misunderstood or actually not given the relevance, the importance that it should receive.
Well,
The world of branding and so forth quite often overcomes the word and the image and the text. But we both have a background in traditional, I'm sure you as I did, I was on press with the number ones, I was taught hot metal, I was taught how to hand render, I was taught um, letraset and cut and paste and everything
yeah,
that we used to do in those days. And then, of
exactly.
course, there was the democratization of graphic design with the Mac and desktop publishing and everything else that's come from that. Same with photography, suddenly is in every smartphone. Where we are today sounds very familiar to me with self-publishing as to where you were in the 1960s with small independent publishers.
Yes,
Is that
I agree.
something you agree with?
I do. I do. I mean, I mean, a lot of people have been very successful at, self-publishing. Publishers obviously don't like it because, they've got a big setup. I mean, publishers now, really, they're so large. I mean, I think the Penguin, whatever the American side is, well, they have something like, I think 57 individual imprints under one roof. And so their sales departments are huge and full of, you know, it's the salespeople that get the money. The art directors have become, they have to, it's almost like they've got to be, they'll have good ones, but they have to, it's almost like they've been affected by the Stockholm syndrome, where you're having to do things that you actually dislike, but you end up thinking, oh well, this is the way to do it. So that's why I know, I don't want to name any of the art directors, but there are a lot of really good ones and have done great work, but they have to turn out this stuff that must be really difficult for them to do. And they all have teams of young designers as well who are probably doing that. They're just giving them these things that the type's got to be enormous. You've got to put 10, quotes on the front cover. So I think self-publishing means that you are in charge. Now, that's a gamble, but you can do it. And I think it will. And there are small independent publishers still, thank goodness, all over the country, little ones that actually have formulas for their covers, which are very pleasant, and I've posted those where they obviously can't afford a big sales department, and those are the publishers that I love because I think you're getting a bit of they're not treating people like imbeciles. I mean, some of the quotes on covers are ridiculous, because they're just like two words, and they put. I've seen Faber and Faber, who used to have a great reputation. Um, they've had up to 6 individual quotes on a front cover, which is covering up some poor illustrator's work. And it's an insult. That's why I get so angry about it. So I think, if you can do it yourself and do it successfully and you're in control of it, that is fantastic.
Yeah, but I think the thing with photography now and with photographers is
Mm.
obviously the sales of self-published books are small. If you can sell
Yeah,
500 copies, you're doing
yeah,
well.
yeah.
Um, but one of the things that I know, I think we kind of are coming to this from the same place, but in slightly different ways. In that, you're brilliant on threads where you go into Waterstones and you say, look, here are the books on their table. Look how terrible the covers are. I'm now looking at photography books in a similar
Mm,
way,
mm,
particularly the self published ones, because photographers are now seeing themselves as the designers of their own books. And they're doing what the majors are doing, which they're kind of looking at photo books that exist and then
Yeah.
thinking, that's what I need to do. But actually, what it creates is a homogenous kind of approach because
Yeah.
graphic design is difficult.
It is. I agree with you. I mean, the thing is, as we all know, online you can get all sorts of help with structures and all that. But I mean, it's pretty clear that it's just a packaged thing that people just put up, and you think, oh well, that's graphic design is a complex business, and it takes you many, many years to understand it, and to be brave enough to obviously, if we're talking about, minimalism, for example, or the Swiss style, there's a discipline, but I've always loved breaking discipline. You've got to understand the discipline in order to break the discipline. But when you do it and you know what you're doing, it can be fantastic. And I'm not against having, I'd rather publisher, have a really good house style and keep it like that rather than have this mishmash. So, for example, when Faber and Faber, John McConnell took over that for 10 years, it was absolutely brilliant because he was using illustrators, photographers really well, and then suddenly overnight it all goes wrong,
Well, of course,
and
you're talking.
they're back to where they were.
Well, of course, John's a great art director as well, but also
Yeah,
I think the key to this, and this is one of the really great reasons I wanted to talk to you, is that recognition that actually, as a graphic designer, as an art director, what we're trying to do is bring image together with text,
yeah,
with an understanding of the story to
yeah.
create something more than. And when you
Yes.
start saying Swiss school and so forth, the majority of my listeners will have no idea what you're talking about. I do because I'm trained as well.
Yes, no, I apologize to photographers that might be listening.
But I think they
It's
should know. That's the
you
thing.
should. It's what just as photography in itself is an incredibly important area that takes many years to get to where you want to be. And you do it as with graphic design. You start off by looking at things that move you, and then you copy them or try to emulate them until such times as one day you wake up and you're at a point where you're your own person. You've absorbed all of this stuff, and you're beginning to produce stuff yourself that is you. And I think that photographers should understand that graphic design is exactly the same thing. And many graphic areas, not just graphic areas, you know, areas that involve creativity, and there are, you can work with wood and it can be beautiful, So I think that I think to be to feel that you can just take over an area yourself. Okay, you could miraculously do it. I mean, if I were a photographer, I'd be very, obviously the image is the important thing. I don't want to destroy the image. And so you have to, you know, you could put the wrong piece of type on, something as simple as that, really bad piece of typography on a great image, and it turns it into mishmash because they perhaps haven't got an understanding that typography and typefaces themselves can express an emotion. Some typefaces are absolutely moving. You can put them on, you think, oh, that's just really works. Other typefaces could be very powerful, So, but it's understanding, how to use them, whether you use them large, small, range left, range right. All of these things have an effect on an image that as a photographer, you want to show to the world. So I would, any photographer that is trying to get a book, try and hook up in some way with a graphic designer who knows their stuff, and it's not a. I mean, I've over the years done so many, in my life, so many things for nothing because someone has asked me. I'm sure you're the same, and you're more attracted to the job, to the actual physical, getting this job. The money side just goes out of the window. So I've worked for charities and all sorts of things because I've been given an opportunity to do what I want, but I don't get to pay for it. And that's for me great because you become the client. And if you're the client of a project, you want it to be good for you,
Yeah, no, you're
rather than
absolutely.
just to get the money.
Yeah, yeah. I think we've all turned down jobs we should have done for the money, but
Oh yeah, 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 yeah.
so I think one of the interesting things there you were saying about with the book, for example, you used to be given the manuscript and you'd
Mm,
read the manuscript before you started to design anything. Same thing when I used to design magazine spreads, magazine stories. We never did anything until we read the article. The article
mm,
was the lead. And I think for a lot of photographers, this understanding of narrative and being able to convey the narrative either to the viewer or to the person they're working with is the key, actually, to creating a book which makes sense as a whole. And I think that's often misunderstood. I see book after book after book with an image on the right hand page, a blank page facing it, a piece of text on a very nice cloth bound cover, and that's it. I don't see any sense of using the design as part of the narrative.
mm. Yeah, well, you'd have to look at any of those to kind of deconstruct why they've ended up like that. I mean, for photographic, I mean, I've got in this house here, I gave away recently 200 books to the university down here, and I was going through because of this chat we were having at the number of photographic books I've got. I've got so many, and they're big format books, by all the greats, and beautifully, I because there was a period in the 90s going into the 2000s when basically I was still very into photography and I was photographing a lot myself and using it in projects. And so I bought lots and lots of books, I absorbed them all. And I still, you know, as with books, I'm sure you've got a library. I can see books behind you, but it's not. I've got one here. I've got because I had a studio in London and I moved last year down here, which is my official home. I brought as many books as I've got here already again. And I thought, what am I going to do? The house is like a mad library. So I contacted the university and they were delighted. So I took them to them, but I kept all of the good ones. And many of them are photographs. Funnily enough, I went back, look at these old, you probably look at these.
Oh,
This
Cameron,
goes back.
well, yeah,
I used to get this. This is 1975, that one.
well, that's
And I've
Creative
got
Camera and Camera Magazine. And if you're interested in Creative Camera, it's a separate thing, but I made a documentary feature-length film about Bill Jay, who was
oh right,
the guy
really?
who basically created Creative Camera. So
Yes.
a slight tangent, but
Mm.
and also I have to admit that I have had to have a 2 day auction of my photo books to reduce it somewhat.
I hope
Um,
it was successful.
it was successful, but also what you can see behind me is just part of 100 years of the British Journal of Photography bound. Um,
Oh, right, okay.
so yes, I have the illness in the same way that you have the illness
Yeah,
of collecting
yeah,
books, but um, those photography books you're talking about there, the
yeah,
greats, the large formats, photography books kind of fall into two areas, don't they? They were very
yeah,
different in the 70s, 80s, 90s as to where we are now because the advent of digital printing. And as I was saying, because it's so easy now to design your own book, all you need
yeah,
is InDesign and you're away.
yeah,
And it's easy to send it to a digital printer.
yeah.
Um, I think that although it's perceived to be a golden era of photo books, I personally feel that it's ended up with books that shouldn't or don't need to exist.
Oh God. Well, I mean, the number of Chinese companies that you can you send them all your photographs, they'll put it all together and send it back as a book. And I have to say, of all people, the Chinese are brilliant at digital, reproduction, really good, because a lot of it is very crappy, but they somehow have got it off to a fine art. And they've always been, certainly back when I was designing a lot of books, but big books when we would have sort of European illustration and things like that, they would all be done out there in China, and they were just fantastic and so careful. So I think it's true. I mean, because I've had taken lots of photographs. I had some of those little books made myself, and I designed them, and they're very simple. So I do know what you mean, and but whether I mean, they were not for sale. They were just for me, to memories of my children, so that sort of thing. But I'm sure you're right. But then people will only buy what they want to buy. So
Well, but that's a key thing, though, isn't it? Finding that balance between not selling out that the big publishers do to try and get sales, 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 and create something which has an audience.
yeah.
Because, quite often, I mean, some of the probably the most interesting book covers that you and I are interested in didn't
Mm.
sell that many copies, but at the same time, they did have an audience.
Yes, yeah, true. I mean, we are talking about really such different times. You know, you're going for, it's a bit like, you know, when we went from analog to digital, it it happened relatively quickly when we actually embraced it in the early 80s at Carol Dempsey and Thurkel. And what happened, which was real tragedy, it was that within literally, because we all, used to send our copy to a local uh,
Typesetters.
typesetting company, and there are a lot of really brilliant ones in London at the time, th and those guys had been trained for sometimes 3 to 4 years on the intricacies of putting type together. You never got widows or rivers or all of those things that you took for granted. You just say, I want you to set it in accidents, grotesque, range, whatever, and it would come back beautifully, and you may make a few little comments, and that's it. Suddenly, overnight, they all went out of business, and you got some of the worst typography because none of the designers who are now working on this new world, they couldn't. It took several years to get the type back to the way it was. It just didn't. It was just very messy. Even some of the best known, graphic design companies were producing work where you think, the letter spacing, the kerning, everything was just a mess because nobody slowly, obviously, that's been sorted, and you've got this new generation, a whole new generation are born and come into the business and know nothing about analog, those things. It seemed like some ancient craft based area. Yet they're all going off and having, working on, with presses and messing around with inks and all those things and loving it. And then it can't be, it can only, print is something that it exists, and every piece of print that you print out is slightly different. It's going to be, and so it's a bit like going back to the French farm workers jacket thing. You get them for tuppence, and yet suddenly there are all these little shops popping up over the years where they cost £250. Or you can go to, I've forgotten, there's one shop that's like the local shop you used to get, up and down the country where you could buy brushes and kettles and things like that, where everything is like 4 times as much, and they all wear, French farmers jackets or brown coats, as if you're walking back into the 1950s. It's a kind of nostalgia for much younger people that find it, this period was amazing. It's a nostalgia for something they never really experienced. And so they've recreated it for themselves. It's like living in a 1950s, shop.
But I think also that it's interesting you use that word nostalgia because I think that also the photo book it is a nostalgic thing, but it also because it's been there through the history of the medium.
Mm,
Um,
mm.
but I also think that to a certain extent it acts as a validation in a digital world that you're creating something that has some kind of longevity and value to it because it exists as a thing. And when
Yeah.
you're making work all of the time digitally, you've then got something analog. And there's an interesting kind of dichotomy there because you're using digital materials to make something that exists. Okay, it's being digitally printed, but all the crafts that you and I were trained in are still there. They are still relevant in book design today.
Yeah, I mean, one has to sort of subtly consider the the traditional world of photography, i.e., film, of which there are still many using film. But and I was working with so many. I mean, I'll just name some of the photographers I
Mm,
work with regularly. So um, Robert Golden, who you may or may not know,
yeah.
I gave him his first job when he came over from America on book covers. Red Saunders, Tony Evans, who I work with a lot, who is absolutely brilliant. Graham Miller, I worked with him for, Andy Seymour. We were kind of bonded. All of those, and Dennis Waugh, Barbara and Safa Baron, Louis Malatero, Jean-Luc Bernard, they were all photographers I was using, both in publishing and in my own companies when I started those. And they were all working, on traditional film. That, just as AI is encroaching now on so many worlds, then they had the choice. And so many of the frogs I used at the time said, no, there's no way we're going digital. I think within a year and a half, 2 years, virtually all of them. Then came the whole thing about printing. You know, they would then discover that all of those great, people that were used to, to print a photographer's work, because they would not all be like Don McCullum, who prints his own stuff. They would have a guy that was brilliant at it, and do all the dodging and making the sky darker, whatever it is. Suddenly that could be done digitally. And so, so those poor guys got removed. Um, and then it's down to, so then you have a digital print rather than a traditional print. I mean, again, a lot of photographers will still have it made in the traditional way. But I think we move on with the times, and in the end, people can't tell the difference. Whereas
No,
you,
but I think it's really important that idea though of moving on with the times because we can do that, but we can also do it with an eye to the past. That when everything is moving quite so quickly, it's very easy to think that you can do everything yourself, but you can't. You do need people who have trained in specific areas to work with and actually collaborate. What you're talking about with those photographers you worked with was collaboration.
absolutely, yeah, yeah. No, I mean, it's all collaboration, really. Unless you are I work with and have over the years illustrators. Now, I think, and illustration is changed a lot, lots of digital, but there are still illustrators that would, literally my image of illustrators when I was in publishing used to be often illustrators tended to be women, although there were as many men, but the ones that shone were women. And they would be at home in the kitchen on a kitchen table with some inks and a pen or whatever, with a cat, by their side, doing, that was the scene. Now some of them are doing digital this and that. It's a bit like, what's his name? The the painter, David Hockney.
Yeah.
So he paints still, but he mastered, you know, producing work on a tablet brilliantly. I mean, he's always been innovative, you know, as we know from using Polaroids and piecing together, you know, pieces of work to. So he's always been very clever, and he's someone that is the only thing he can't stand is that, you know, why can't I smoke everywhere? You
Yeah.
know, but you know, he's always embraced uh, you know, different forms of modern technology to get what he wants. And I think that's perfectly fine. And that involves collaboration. But his core is he can sit there and draw beautifully. End of story.
Yeah. If even if when the electricity goes down, he can still do
Yeah.
it, which is
Nothing to
key.
plug in. Yeah.
So if you were talking to a photographer now
Mm.
who was about to produce their own photo book, publish it themselves to sell, um, what would your advice be?
Well, I would go to I would certainly be looking at lots of work, and not just for the purpose of your own book, but I would have been looking at books for ages. Um, you know, the photographer's gallery shop, for example, you go there and there's a huge range of books. You go to, you know, the big um, booksellers in London, and they'll have floors of books on photography. And I'd look at them, and and you will get, I think, if on the really good ones, there'll be you know, there will be some kind of message to you about how a book is presented, you know. Um, but again, I think that they really need to bone up on graphic design, understand what graphic design can really do, and it can do virtually everything you want it to do. You know, if the work you've got is so good, then you just everything else is secondary. It's the work that you want to show. And if you start, the problem with a lot of graphic designers that don't understand the subject that they're dealing with is that they try to become the photography, like, you know, they're going to say, well, I'm going to show them how, you know, let's do the typography. And it then becomes about typography. That's why I think working with an image of a photographer's image, that is the king or queen or whatever you want to call it. That's the purpose. And then everything else has to complement it, but not overwhelm it. And that is the problem with a lot of books where they've allowed, perhaps hooked up with a graphic designer, and allowed them to show themselves.
Yeah,
So most of the
it's
people
what
I
I
know that, yeah, go on.
oh, no, sorry, I was just I want to add this. It's what I call visual knitting. It's when the ego of the designer becomes more important than the work
Yeah,
they're working with.
you're quite right. Now, there's a designer that who is absolutely brilliant at dealing with Mark Farrow, who has produced a lot of books for photographers that have photographed groups, you know, bands and things like that. You know, very highly trendy ones from, you know, certain periods that are highly collectible. His work is so sympathetic and quiet because he wants those images to shine, and he knows exactly what he's doing. And you know, I've posted quite a lot of his work because I've always admired him. Going, he just knows how to leave it alone, you know. And I think that's the problem with designers. They don't want to leave. They get to a point and they want to add a bit more.
Yeah,
And that's all about really also, again, trends that are going through in a different world. Graphic design has its own trends that come and go, as we all know. You know, I've been in this business now for 60 years. So I've seen the trends come, go, come back, go again, come back, you know, so I can spot them.
yeah.
Um,
It's a really key thing. I was talking to the art director who did Martin Parr's The Last Resort, the first book,
yeah,
um, and it could not be more 1987.
yeah,
With funny little colored things going across the page and what have you. And
yeah,
he's a bit embarrassed by it because it was the trend. It didn't need.
Yes, well, I think you fall. This is the problem, falling into trends is inevitable. Graphic design, there's a time when um, even the best graphic designers get seduced by what's going on. They feel, oh, I got to, get to grips with it. And when you see that work, it's poor because you can see they've been infected for a short space of time, going down a path that's not them at all. Stay with who you are. Okay, you can change, but make it your change rather than following, jumping on the bus and basically just copying everyone else. It's having the confidence to I mean, I'm in a position now where, I'm retired basically, but I'm not retired because I work on lots of things. But whatever I take on, it's something I'd like to do. Otherwise, I won't take it on. And I can just be myself. I don't have to worry about trends. I'm not interested in trends. I haven't seen any trends that really inspire me. I've seen all the trends. What I'm seeing, what I see now is just people regurgitating trends. In
Yeah.
the publishing world, particularly, it's astonishing how much is. I posted something the other day which seemed to upset someone, and it was a piece of typography that I found on a cover where it had fragmented the title um, all across the page, but you could work it out what it was. It was kind of almost like a visual test. And it had been used by another designer in a sort of similar way, as if it was remarkably new, by putting it. And I didn't name the designer, I just went back to this original cover that was done in the 60s and just put it there, and then got an email from two people saying, why have you put that up and so forth. And I was just saying, I can usually pinpoint things that have been done before several times and find you evidence that it's not original. It's actually somebody else's idea that's been regurgitated, and there's nothing wrong with that as long as you're open by it. We're all influenced in our life by other people, and I always like to acknowledge it. Thanking those people that went before that were great, that affected you.
Um,
But
I couldn't agree with you more, Mike. It's something that I talk about a lot, is that willingness to be honest about where your
yes,
influences come from. Um,
totally.
so I would say that in kind of conclusion, then, do your research, avoid trends, find a graphic designer that you can collaborate with. I would add to that Dieter Ramsey's less but better. Uh,
Absolutely. I couldn't
and
agree with you more.
and also don't follow what everyone else is doing. Try and find an approach that's appropriate to the story you're trying to tell.
Yes, because you're showing your images, which are your images, and they are hopefully something very special for you. And so don't try and follow other trends. I mean, be aware of them, and be aware of books that move you, because usually they're the ones that have been designed well. The person that has been the designer is sensitive and collaborative and understanding that they should take a back row. This is about another person's creative, work and not yours. And sadly, young designers particularly, because they want to make it, they want people to know, oh, it's by me. And so they're almost insulting the very thing that they've been given by trying to overwhelm it with their own view of the world. And I think that's just being the young designer who haven't really understood, how certain things should work. I mean, there was a whole period back in, probably 25 years ago where I'm not going to name designers, but there were one or two American designers where they would take one of the things that would drive me mad is copy. I'm a great believer in good copywriters, and I would never interfere with their work. I would always set it so it's readable. But there were designers in America that were just using, and in this country, ignoring that, running copy so it goes off the page and onto the next page. So it's cut off. You turn over the page and get half. insulting to the writer. And that sort of behavior is ridiculous. Why bother to have a writer write if you're going to destroy their work by breaking it up and making it as a design, almost like confetti, I'll put a bit here, a bit there. And, so I think being aware of other disciplines and understanding that they are disciplines and creative disciplines in their own right and work with them sensitively rather than use them as some kind of plaything.
I think that's a perfect place to end it, Mike, although I know we could keep going for hours because we are definitely on literally the same page on many
Well,
of
that's
our
good.
thoughts. I really recommend that listeners follow Mike on Threads, which is, if I'm right, Studio Dempsey.
Yes, there are two things on Studio Dempsey. There's my website, but also now um, I have my blog, which I resurrected. I had a blog running from 2006, and the company in America just said to everyone, "We're closing in 30 days' time." And I thought, so I've now got my blog back, and I'm in control of it, and I'm reposting lots of written stuff with images, of course, on my. So if you go to Studio Dempsey, which is there's a bar at the top, and it'll go on to blog, and you click onto that, and you'll see a lot of work, not just my own, other people's work, great photography. So that's worth a look because it's a long form writing. I write long pieces.
And I would recommend that as the education that every single photographer needs if you want to try and understand graphic design, because it's going to impact your website, it's going to impact any books, it's going to impact everything you do with your photography. Mike, thank you so much. I think we might have to do this again another time.
Well, thank you, Grant, and it's very kind of you to ask me to be part of this. I'm very honoured, so thank you.
It's an absolute pleasure.
Okay.